Hi folks, this is Don Meissner with the North Country Fishing Report. You know, one of the things that has always presented a challenge to me is how to fish really light, tiny baits. Well, first of all, if you're going to be able to cast a tiny bait out, you've got to have really light line because there's less resistance. It's going to carry that. It's going to allow that bait to carry it out much farther than if you were using heavier line. But the other thing is the type of rod that you use is so critical as well, because the rod builds up a force, builds up a power, and it allows you to cast it out there. But it has to be just the right length, and the tip of the rod is critical. And one of the things I've tried, I've gone in the past using, let's say, a rod 6.5 or 7 feet long that had a really light tip, like a fly rod. But I found that I couldn't cast my light lures that well because as the rod bends, as the tip bends, it actually whips back right as soon as you're trying to cast out. Once you release it, the rod comes back the other way, the tip of it, and it actually pulls the line back. So just you don't want it to be too whippy or it won't cast the lure as great as you might think. This is really critical because the tinier the lure that you use will give a total different impression to the fish. And it's easy to use tiny light stuff on a fly rod because you've got a floating line, you've got no weight that you're casting, and the lure is going to float down naturally in the water. When you're using spinning tackle, you've got to have some weight to be able to cast it out there. And once that hits the water, rather than floating down naturally, it's going to start to sink. So the heavier the bait becomes, the less effectively you can drift it so that it looks natural. And the word natural is terribly critical here. That bait has to look like something they want to eat, that they're used to having float down the water, and you've got to be able to present it so it's floating down naturally. When I say floating, it may be under the surface, but it's still kind of floating. Once it's too heavy, it's not going to float. It's going to go down the bottom and bump along the bottom unless you use a float or something. So I really find this critical, and I want to jump ahead to how successful I've been this year trout fishing because I've devoted far more of my time than since I was a kid to trout. And I think I'm even better now than I was then because I'm learning more. I have so much more to observe than when I was younger. And I've watched how these trout will react to some of the light stuff I'm using that's not much different than using a fly. It may be made out of plastic, soft plastic instead of fur, or it might be made out of fur. But I've noticed, and I'm going to be very specific now, the baits that I'm using for trout with an ultralight rod that does what I said earlier in this report, in terms of being able to cast it out there, I'm using 1/32 of an ounce baits. Now, the next size up from that is 1/16 ounce in most cases. And it's still tiny. A 1/16 ounce bait can be tiny, but it's not looking the same in the water because it's not floating the same. And I've come to realize that. And so I'm choosing only 1/32 ounce baits now, and I'm allowing them to float down much as if I was using a fly. The rod's as sensitive and light as a fly rod. I'm having all the joy that I would have had fly fishing using baits just as small, but I'm able to do it with a spinning rod and light line. Does it make it more fun? No, I love fly fishing, but it makes it more available for a lot of people that don't have the ability to cast a fly as far or to reach the same water that they could with a spinning rod. Until next time, folks, this is Don Meissner with the North Country Fishing Report.